Gunfire rang out in our nation's capital today, leaving Hamilton, Ontario's Corporal Nathan Cirillo dead and our nation in shock. Joining us now for the latest on today's events and the implications of this attack on national security in Ottawa. Via Skype, there's Jamie Long. He's a digital reporter for CBC Ottawa. Jamie, it's good of you to join us tonight. I wonder if we could start by just having you tell us, how did your day start?
Well, Steve, I guess it started, I was at my desk, sat down after our meeting. Immediately, it seemed people started storming downstairs saying a guard was shot at the National War Memorial. So basically, all hands were on deck, and I ran out the door. And I guess the War Memorial's a couple of blocks away from the office, very close. So I ran over, and I got there before officers had even got there. So some bystanders were administering CPR to the guard, Nathan Cirillo, as you said, who had been shot. And he was soon after brought into an ambulance and taken to hospital. I saw that happen, and as I tried to take that in, I looked over and I spoke to a few witnesses who were also there, and many of them were tourists, some French tourists and a Dutch tourist I spoke to, who described the suspect, the shooter, who we have now learned his name and such, and talked about kind of what he did and what he had done before and then after running to Parliament Hill after taking that shot and hitting the guard.
Apparently he was shot in the chest, died. He is the father of a 6-year-old son. If you go on Facebook, you'll see some quite lovely pictures with him and his kid, with him and his dogs. And, well, that's a very sad moment for the country today. You did not see the gunman, did you?
I did not. I did not see the gunman. By the time I arrived, it was probably about the time he had gotten into to Parliament Hill, and we have now heard about what happened there. How he took a car and went into center block and fired shots, and of course he was shot dead inside the center block. And that was probably happening. It happened very fast. He took the shot, he jumped in the car, he drove over, and went into Parliament Hill and found his way in there and fired some shots, and at least one guard was injured there as well. And if we know now, that's where he was shot dead. So I did not see him. By the time I got there, he had left the scene, and he had left the guard injured on the ground. And basically many people just basically in shock over what had just happened. And many people, I guess, nobody chased after the man. People were just standing there trying to help the guard who was down.
My recollection, Jamie, and we just had a map up there a second ago showing what close proximity, in fact, the War Memorial is to Parliament Hill. My recollection is that visitors are supposed to sort of go down into the basement to go through a metal detector to enter Parliament Hill. If you've got a pass, you can go up the steps and through the main entrance. Does anybody yet have any idea which entrance the alleged shooter went through?
I am not sure. I believe it was the main floor, but there's no confirmed. Basically, all we see is, as we'll see soon in this video, is just basically hearing shots fired, and we don't know exactly what entrance he entered, where he came into to Parliament Hill, and we're still trying to figure that out. I guess we'll see if we do learn more tonight, or if that seems to come out tomorrow, and we're still going to figure out whether MPs return to Parliament Hill tomorrow. So I guess a lot of those security measures are unknown, and what exactly happened, how he entered center block, and that's a lot of the questions that people are wondering right now, exactly how it happened.
You referred a moment ago to some video, and we want to play this right now. I suspect a lot of our viewers have already seen this, but it is still such shocking and stunning footage that it bears showing again if you've seen it. This is our Parliament. This was taken by Josh Wingrove. He's a reporter with the Globe and Mail. He took this video. Let's play it. We'll come back and chat. Jamie, roll tape, please. Well, what we know, Jamie, is that the shooting stopped because the sergeant at arms apparently fatally shot the assailant. What can you tell us about Kevin Vickers, who is described by many at this hour as the hero of the day?
Yeah, well, he's a former RCMP officer who works on Parliament Hill, and as you probably saw on social media, MPs Peter MacKay thanking him for his work. His younger brother also went on Twitter saying, "Thank you for being there." We heard reports that after the shots were fired, he was seen going back and reloading his gun. We don't know if this was before or after the suspect, the shooter, was shot, but just basically the picture of a pretty strong individual, tough individual who stood tall, I guess, when basically someone was trying to enter our country's main building, basically the White House of Canada, Parliament Hill. So he stood tall, and while there might be some questions over how the shooter entered the building, he stood there, as did some other guards, and stood tall, not letting the man inside.
The one name we haven't mentioned so far is the man who is alleged to have conducted this crime/terrorist attack. I'm still not sure how to describe this. A lot of people are still looking for the right words to describe this. A man thought to be in his early 30s, Michael Zihaf Bibo, recently, we're told, converted to Islam. Recently, we're told, had his passport taken away. He's been arrested 5 times during the course of his life. Can you add anything to the profile we understand at this hour?
Well, we do know that he had some criminal past in Quebec, BC, all over the country, really, and he had lived also in Elmer, which is just across the river from Ottawa, in Quebec. So he did live in the area, and he had a criminal past all across the country, but nothing to the extent as something like this, drug conviction, robbery conviction, but nothing to the level of, anything gun-related, something this extreme. So we don't know yet if he was on the radar of federal officials, whether it was something that there's someone they had tracked. We know recently there's been a lot of talk over the number of people and who exactly they're monitoring and how many people related to the ISIS attacks and everything going on there, whether this was related to that. So we still don't know have those answers yet. We just have, basically, he had been involved in crime. He was convicted and at one point didn't appear in court for another conviction, but for much smaller crimes than this one today.
For the second time this week, there has been a brutal and violent attack on our soil. Today, our thoughts and prayers are with the family and friends of Corporal Nathan Cirillo of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. Corporal Cirillo was killed today, murdered in cold blood, as he provided a ceremonial honor guard at Canada's National War Memorial, that sacred place that pays tribute to those who gave their lives so that we can live in a free, democratic, and safe society. Likewise, our thoughts and prayers remain also with the family and friends of Warrant Officer Patrice Vincent, who was killed earlier this week by an ISIL-inspired terrorist. Tonight, we also pray for the speedy recovery of the others injured in these despicable attacks. Fellow Canadians, we've also been reminded today of the compassionate and courageous nature of so many Canadians, like those private citizens and first responders who came to provide aid to Corporal Cirillo as he fought for his life. And of course, the members of our security forces in the RCMP, the City of Ottawa Police, and in Parliament, who came quickly and at great risk to themselves to assist those of us who were close to the attack. Fellow Canadians, in the days to come, we will learn more about the terrorist and any accomplices he may have had. But this week's events are a grim reminder that Canada is not immune to the types of terrorist attacks we have seen elsewhere around the world. We are also reminded that attacks on our security personnel and on our institutions of governance are, by their very nature, attacks on our country, on our values, on our society, on us Canadians, as a free and democratic people who embrace human dignity for all. But let there be no misunderstanding. We will not be intimidated. Canada will never be intimidated. In fact, this will lead us to strengthen our resolve and redouble our efforts, and those of our national security agencies, to take all necessary steps to identify and counter threats and keep Canada safe here at home. Just as it will lead us to strengthen our resolve and redouble our efforts to work with our allies around the world and fight against the terrorist organizations who brutalize those in other countries with the hope of bringing their savagery to our shores. They will have no safe haven. Well, today has been, without question, a difficult day. I have every confidence that Canadians will pull together with the kind of firm solidarity that has seen our country through many challenges. Together, we will remain vigilant against those at home or abroad who wish to harm us. For now, Lorraine and Ben and Rachel and I join all Canadians in praying for those touched by today's attack. May God bless them and keep our land glorious and free.
Okay, Prime Minister Stephen Harper, his conversations, his discussions, his framing of what happened earlier today in the nation's capital. I want to apologize, of course, to Jamie Long for bailing out of our conversation to take the Prime Minister's comments, which we very much wanted to get to you this evening. If you're just joining us, we're going to do a 1-minute recap here of what happened today, and then we're going to have 4 more guests join us and give their analysis on what we're going to call this today. The Prime Minister was very clear. He's calling it a terrorist attack, but we're going to explore some of the language around that today. In the meantime, here's the timeline of what went down just before 10 o'clock this morning, Eastern Time, in our nation's capital. A gunman, later identified as Michel Zehaf Bibeau, in his 30s, opened fire at the National War Memorial. 1 soldier was killed. Bibeau was then thought to have carjacked a car, stormed Parliament Hill, started firing inside, through the Peace Tower and in the center block on Parliament Hill. He was shot and killed by the Sergeant-at-Arms Kevin Vickers, who is being described as the hero of the day. Parliament Hill has since been placed under lockdown. Yes, there are still members of Parliament, including the opposition leader and the leader of the third party, who are under lockdown on Parliament Hill. Everybody reported safe, though. All the caucuses meet on Wednesdays on Parliament Hill. No injuries to any of our members of Parliament or any of their staff, etc. There were a few other injuries. A security guard was shot in the leg, but he's apparently going to be okay. And the soldier, of course, identified as Corporal Nathan Cirillo, 24 years old, a 6-year-old son from Hamilton, Ontario, a member of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. If you visit his Facebook page, you will see pictures of a man who was so full of life, and that life is now over tonight. Okay, let's introduce our guests on the program, and there he is. Let's introduce our guests on our program tonight. Stockwell Day is with us. He's in Vancouver, British Columbia. He's a former federal cabinet minister, now strategic advisor at Macmillan LLP. In the nation's capital via Skype, Christian Leuprecht. He's a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada. And with us here in studio, Besma Momani, senior fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation, and Jonathan Kay, comment page editor and columnist at the National Post. We want to remind everybody you can be part of this conversation, so join in using the hashtag AgendaTVO if you're online. Sorry, everybody, a little choked up about all this today. Jonathan, what are we calling this?
Well, the Prime Minister calls it terrorism, but that goes to the frame of mind of the gunman who did this. If he had in mind a political act, then it was indeed terrorism. He's now dead. And so we're going to have to try and find out, based on his past, based on the reasons that he was having his travel restricted by the federal government. Presumably the security agencies know a lot more than we do, because there was a reason that his travel from Canada was restricted. He's a recent convert to Islam, perhaps a fan of ISIS, but that information may tell us why he committed this act, and it may justify the Prime Minister's use of the word terrorism.
Stockwell Day, you're a former public security minister in this government. What are you calling what happened today?
It's absolutely a act, from everything we know and we've heard. This individual, who himself had renamed himself Abdul and had claimed to have converted to radical Islamist ideology. He didn't rob a bank, he didn't rob a drugstore, he killed a soldier, and he attacked the Parliament buildings. This is a terrorist act.
Besma Momani, your view?
Well, I mean, the symbolism here, obviously, going into Parliament and the War Memorial, lends itself to calling it a terrorist attack, but he's a criminal, and he's a well-known criminal to security forces, to the police. He has a rap sheet, and I think what we need to know is what was his motivation. I think without a connection to some sort of organized grouping, at a well-known terrorist organization, then we have a lone wolf criminal who did a terrible thing to terrorize people. But is he a terrorist? I think that really depends on, as Jonathan said, what are his connections and motivations?
Does the fact that apparently ISIS had a picture of him that they tweeted out today change your opinion about him at all?
Well, I mean, I think the opinion of him, obviously, right now across the country is that this is a terrible person committing a terrible crime.
What his motive may be. Maybe that's a better question.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that, you know, one thing, let's not forget, ISIS is internet savvy. It has a social media empire. Perhaps more in terms of its strength, in terms of arms and so forth, is its social media presence. So I don't know what the connections are. And I don't think that having sympathy with ISIS, as awful as that is, and there will be people who will be attracted to that type of violence, as awful as it may be, that does not make them necessarily connected to ISIS if they have sympathy with this terrible organization to claim that they are representative of ISIS. So we have to find a link, a causal link between ISIS or a directive from ISIS to this individual to really claim that it is certifiably a terrorist act. That doesn't take away from the reality that it's an awful act.
Christian Leuprecht, what are you calling it? Christian, are you there? Yeah, we're not hearing you, so let's see if we can fix that Skype line to Ottawa, and then we'll come back to you, Christian, and get your take on this. The Prime Minister couldn't have been more clear about what he is regarding this as, Jonathan. He called it a terrorist act, an assault on our values. This was a guy who attacked the War Memorial and then came to Parliament Hill, two pretty significant symbols of what our democracy is. I know we don't want to rush to judgment. It's pretty hard not to rush to judgment tonight, isn't it?
The evidence obviously points to terrorism. The only reason that I offer a caveat is there are sometimes random lunatics who do attack political figures, and it's not attached to any particular ideology. The guy who tried to shoot Ronald Reagan, or who did shoot Ronald Reagan and almost killed him, the guy who allegedly tried to kill Pauline Marois a couple of years ago. Sometimes people attack symbols of national power, they attack national leaders, sometimes for reasons that have nothing to do with politics or religion. They're simply evil lunatics. It happens. In this case, as you say, the evidence does point to something more organized and more terroristic than that. But the media has been burned in the past. I remember with Anders Breivik, when those terrible attacks happened in Norway, newspapers went to press the next day falsely attributing those attacks to militant Islam. It turned out that wasn't the case. So in the past, precedent has shown that we have to be quite careful before we label it terrorism, although I completely agree that in this case, the evidence does suggest that this was a terrorist attack motivated by militant Islam.
Stockwell Day, I wonder if, given your political background, you can put us in the room today, because the Prime Minister's office tweeted a picture out, I guess a couple of hours ago. Prime Minister sitting in a briefing with his Attorney General, his Defense Minister, a couple of other cabinet ministers, the Public Security Minister, which is the job you used to have. What's going on in that briefing? What exactly is the Prime Minister's office trying to figure out at this moment?
Well, the Prime Minister, when that photo was taken, I can tell you with some assurance, would have been saying, I want the hard data, I want the reality on the ground, what is happening. And those ministers, through their security personnel, are trying to give him as accurate a picture as possible. I can tell you the picture in other rooms is not quite as calm, nor can it be. There were words that we heard, you know, when we saw the action out on the streets, like chaos and pandemonium. It doesn't approach that inside the actual war rooms, but they are very intense. People are moving at rapid speed. There are certain locations in the city of Ottawa which are control centers where all information, to which all information is being fed, and decisions have to be made. And unfortunately, the people who are giving direction are having to react to every report that comes in. So if someone says there's 3 people running in this direction on that street, there has to be some corroboration of that, and there has to be police sent to that area. In this case, and all of this is some of this is speculation as we speak, but I can tell you eventually what happened was a very astute parliamentary security team, as we understand, headed by Kevin, whom many of us know, the Sergeant of Arms, a former RCMP, trained for this type of thing. It appears he took decisive action. We have no idea how many lives he saved in doing that. The strategy behind this has changed over the years. It used to be, even up to about 10 years ago, the strategy would be for security forces to lock an area down and try not to force an incident and let the person eventually surrender. We know now from enough of these attacks, Jonathan just mentioned Breivik and others, that the sooner you can eliminate that force, the better off everybody will be. That's the action that the sergeant at arms took, despite, I can tell you, a wave of chaos that was going on around him. But the security people in this case were focused and stopped something that could have been far more horrific, even as tragic as the death of this corporal already is.
That is true, but I'm wondering, given your experience on the Hill and the fact that the sergeant at arms, a 58-year-old man who normally is seen carrying a mace, not a gun, the fact that it was he who took the fatal shot today and not another security official on the Hill, do you know, are the security guards on Parliament Hill, are they armed when they do their daily jobs?
Well, Steve, I'm not giving out any secrets. Anybody who's been to the House of Commons know that there are certain individuals that do have firearms. I've always felt that people may not be aware, the security is sort of split. On the Hill itself, it's the RCMP that has jurisdiction. But in the actual building, this may sound a little strange, it's actually the Speaker of the House of Commons, the Speaker of the Senate, who have jurisdiction. You can actually, if that person had run towards the Senate doors, there would have been officers there, but they would have been unarmed. And the mayhem that could have been created would have been phenomenal. There's few jurisdictions in the world where you can approach the center of government and right in the inner core face people who are unarmed. It has been my suggestion in the past, it would continue to be mine, that now that there is a thoughtful discussion on this, but I strongly recommend that those officers, all those security officers inside who are charged with seeing who's coming in and who's coming out, that they are armed. We'll find out exactly how Kevin was able to get himself in a position. You're right, he usually carries a mace, and which wouldn't have been effective, but he obviously had close at hand the capabilities to use lethal force. He did that. But this division of responsibility, and I'm not saying this in any pejorative sense, the officers in both the Parliamentary Security Division and the RCMP, they're highly trained, they work well, but you have to have absolutely seamless communication. You have to have seamless chain of command, and you need to have the security officers inside there armed so that they can prevent this type of thing from being worse.
Okay. Besma, I want to read to you a tweet that I saw earlier today. In light of the fatal attack on a soldier 2 days ago, in light of the fatal attack on a soldier today, the tweet simply said, "We're at war." Do you agree?
It's really hard to sort of assess that. You know, in some way, we are in active engagement in some war. Our troops are abroad. As much as we don't have boots on the ground in combating ISIS, we have boots in the air. And that means we are, in a way, at war. We are at war with ISIS. I think that's a reality of the fact that we are engaged, the fact that we have already sought out a militarized solution to this.
We always knew we were at war over there. I inferred from the comment, we're at war at home now. Do you agree?
Well, then the question is, who is the enemy here at home? And we need to be very careful about that. You know, I think that when we talk about war at home, it obviously connotes, I think, and it raises the eyebrows of many people in the Muslim community who are often being targeted, sadly and unfortunately, for these kinds of crimes. When these people are branding themselves and self-proclaiming themselves to be Muslim converts, but they're not really attached to the Muslim community in Canada, which is often the case. You know, this is sort of a franchise situation where people are self-proclaiming, self-converting, and then go out there and are, you know, obviously the worst ambassador possible for the Islamic community here in Canada.
Despicable acts in the name of Islam, but not following Islam.
And have no connection to the Islamist community. In fact, the Muslim community here, what we've seen are people, if there are radicalized elements, and not to say that that hasn't entered in mosques and other places of worship where these people have showed up, they're quickly being basically informed upon. There are informants within the mosque, the imams themselves, the leaders of these mosques that are talking to police and to security officials. Many of the mosques in this country have fantastic relationship with the security forces and say, here's a person that's come in, he's, you know, spewing acts and ideas that don't resonate in this community, do something about them. And I think that's the best way. There's an ounce of prevention here that can be really useful. But saying we're at war, then the question is who is the enemy? And I'm really afraid of the slippery slope that we get into and really labeling an entire faith. You know, this is the city of Toronto. Almost 10% of Toronto are of Muslim descent. We have to be really careful. Let's not do, I think, the mistake of past governments when they, you know, quickly brandish an entire faith as the enemy. Let's not do that. It's not us versus them. This is a collective problem. This is a collective issue. And I think when we stand together, we're much more resilient.
Jonathan, we've been at war in Afghanistan for 10 years. We are now with 6 planes over in the Middle East. Are we at war at home now?
No, we're not at war. We're fighting against isolated, terroristic, radicalized individuals. And unfortunately, their reach has grown because of social media, because of the videos we see. It's a horrible tragedy that a man was shot in Ottawa, but we have to put this in perspective. 30 years ago, Denis Lortie walked into the Quebec legislature and killed 3 people. We weren't at war then. You've had isolated spasms of terrorism all during.
But let me jump in. He didn't do that in the name of an ism.
Well, he didn't. Or we could go to Air India when you had dozens of Canadians who were slaughtered in the name of Sikh independence movement.
Yes.
And that didn't mean we were at war. It is absolutely true that there is a radicalized Islamist movement around the world and has some isolated followers here in Canada. But overall, I think the Islamist threat in Canada is probably less than it is in almost any other Western country on earth. And I think we should appreciate that. And also, as was said before, it is primarily Muslims who are the informants on these people. If you remember the Toronto 18 terror plot, it was Muslim insiders at the mosque who reported that to the RCMP. And if it weren't for them, that plot might have come to fruition. So we shouldn't exaggerate the threat from the Muslim community in Canada. And I don't like the use of the word war because I think it takes away from the real wars we've fought, including the war that we fought in Afghanistan, World War II. To call it a war simply because there are isolated spasms of terror, that does a disservice to the word war.
I don't want to trivialize what happened today by talking about politics. However, I want to be responsive to many of the people who tweeted to me today on Twitter. I spent a lot of time on Twitter today trying to find out what people out there were thinking and feeling and interested in and concerned about. And one of the things that I saw on numerous occasions, Stockday, let me try this with you first. They said, wouldn't it be wonderful if the Prime Minister and Tom Mulcair and Justin Trudeau and Elizabeth May all spoke together? If they all came before the cameras together, and perhaps one at a time, but all together, made the point that I guess the Prime Minister wanted to make tonight. Do you have any idea whether, A, that was ever under consideration in the Prime Minister's office tonight, and B, what you think of the idea?
Well, as much as I might be strongly partisan on political issues or even on economic issues and at different opinions with Mr. Mulcair and Mr. Trudeau, I can tell you, knowing these men, actually considering them friends, and certainly knowing the Prime Minister, their views, their sense of horror and heartbreak, they share those views. There's no question about that. Usually when you do media, as you know, Steve, you are invited at separate times to appear, and so that's part of the issue. There would be nothing wrong with them showing a united front and linking arms. What we do need to know and realize here, the Prime Minister, as we just watched him, very heartfelt, very thoughtful. He touched all of our hearts on what he said. We do have to realize that that did nothing to the hearts of those who are committed to kill us, quite frankly. This question of being at war. Well, when someone declares war on you, when they try to kill you, when they kill your soldiers, when they attack your buildings, and they say we are at war with you, we can't just sort of shrug our shoulders and say, well, we're not at war with you. We are at war with a collective group, loosely knit around the world, who self-proclaim as Muslims, who have a duty to kill infidels and non-Muslims. Now, to Bisma's point, this is not the majority of Muslims that we know in our neighborhoods and who are our friends and that we work with every day all across Canada. But this collective, loosely collective group does exist around the world. They are a network, and they are at war, not just with us. They are at war with anybody who disagrees with them. So a linking of arms of the 4 leaders, that may be of additional comfort to Canadians, might even be a good thing to do, will have absolutely no effect on people whose goal, number one, is to kill you and hopefully be killed in the process. So it's a very different way of approaching protection when you're talking about these people, this group that in fact we are at war with. It's not a country. It is a vicious, and Jonathan used the word lunacy. Frankly, a group of people who find some kind of solace in beheading large numbers of people, raping and enslaving women, slaughtering children. They are in fact lunatics in my view, even though they rationalize their view and rationalize their acts as some kind of allegiance to Allah, which we all know is totally off base and off mark. But with this group who align themselves this way, who self-proclaim, Couture referred to himself as Ahmad, and the individual today called himself Abdul. They are this collective group around the world, and there are Muslims, thankfully the majority of Muslims, who stand with us against them, and we need to consider and be aware that we are, in fact, at war with them.
Okay, I am happy to be able to say now that Christian Leuprecht and the Skype feed to Ottawa has been fixed. Christian, you can hear me okay?
I can indeed.
Great. Thank you for joining us tonight, and we're sorry you couldn't participate until just now, but you've had a chance to listen to our conversation, and perhaps you'll just react to whatever you want to react to so far. Where do you want to pick it up from?
Well, I think one of the issues that's under discussion here is the difference between correlation and causation. So there's lots of people who hold radical ideas and hold ideas that are at the margins of our society, but the bulk of them do not move from thought to action. And so the challenge is, and that's the challenge that Canadian courts have provided for our security and our criminal intelligence agencies, is that they want evidence that somebody, that there's good reason to believe that somebody is likely to move to action, in part because what people say is actually a poor predictor of what they're going to do. And the reason I raise this is that, of course, we couch this all in the language of radicalization, but often ideology, Islamism, becomes simply an instrumentalized tool for violence that people might have committed anyways, and that just becomes the convenient excuse. And we know that out of the dozen mechanisms that are at play when people commit this type of violence, they combine differently in different cases and for different types of individuals. And so, yes, you might be radicalized, but what puts you over the top might be, as in the case of the individual in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, the fact that he might have lost a custody case and as a result had a hate-on for the Canadian state.
Okay, let me, Jonathan, get you to react to the question I posed to Stockday a second ago, which was a better image if all four major party leaders showed up together on television to jointly say, you know, you can't mess with our democracy and get away with it.
There are some precedents for this. When Jack Layton died, you did see people crossing the aisle, and it does happen occasionally, and now would be a good time for it. I actually thought Mr. Harper set a nice tone in his in the short speech he gave tonight, and I thought a lot of the thoughts that he gave could be echoed by all the party leaders. Could be, maybe should be at the same time, at the same moment? That's the question. I think it would be an appropriate gesture. I think you saw... An appropriate gesture, you say? It would be an appropriate gesture, yeah. Okay. All right. Besma, your view on that?
Yeah, I think so too, but I wonder if the security situation in Ottawa is not conducive to doing that right now.
I guess that's part of the problem. Like Mulcair and Trudeau are probably still under lockdown, aren't they?
Yeah, I think they're all in separate quarters, and so maybe collectively getting everyone together may have been difficult. But I think in the days to come, I hope that we do see something like that. It's really important for Canadians to see all political leaders really not politicking at this really important time.
I do remember, and I don't want to push any comparisons to 9/11, although I saw that on Twitter today as well, some people asking whether this was our 9/11. Let's remember there were 3,000 people killed that day. But all the party leaders went together to New York for the services on those occasions, so I just put that out there for what it's worth. Reminding everybody, we would like to hear from you, continue to hear from you. We're having a Twitter chat online right now at #AgendaTVO. Jonathan, let me try this with you. When President Kennedy was killed, the National Football League got into a hell of a lot of trouble because they didn't cancel football games the next day, or 2 days later. I note tonight there's supposed to be a National Hockey League game in Ottawa between the Senators and the Toronto Maple Leafs, which has been canceled. Did they make the right decision?
No, I think the game should have been played.
How come?
Well, first of all, hockey is a bonding experience for Canadians, so there's that. The other thing is you want to show terrorists, if that's what this was, that they're not going to succeed in intimidating people. And I think what happened is after 9/11 is people became extremely conservative in the way they called these things. And after the Boston Marathon, you had that city under lockdown for a couple of days because of one murderer running around. It's a horrible thing, but you have cities in the United States where dozens of murders happen every week, but the city isn't on lockdown. And I think you do give the terrorists a certain kind of victory if you can lock down a big city based on one guy who's on the run. In this case, it turns out there probably wasn't even anybody on the run. They'd shot the only terrorist.
Although we don't know that for sure yet.
We don't know that for sure, and there is a certain conservative mentality that says, hey, no one ever lost their job for locking a city down when it didn't need locking down. But if it's a false negative instead of a false positive, hey, you know, maybe we could lose our job if something horrible happens. But ultimately, I think you have to let people live their lives, and it does give terrorists a certain measure of victory if you can demoralize and paralyze an entire city. Especially, I mean, hockey does have symbolic value for Canadians. And to cancel hockey, that's a big deal. You know, the Boston Marathon, let's remember, it went on this year, despite the fact there was a bombing last year, and that was a highly symbolic act. I realize it was a year later, but it was a highly emotional and symbolic act for people in Boston saying, hey, we're not going to be cowed by this. Life goes on. It went on with more security. But still, you know, that was a symbolic gesture of solidarity against terrorism.
On that issue of life goes on, let me pull an audible here. Control room, bottom of chapter 4, Premier Wynne clip. Is that queued up? Can we roll that now? Premier Wynne was in the legislature today. Obviously, the legislature is now sitting. There was some discussion about whether or not question period ought to stand down, whether they ought to cancel the whole thing, you know, cancel the day's business in light of what was going on. Nobody knew whether this was the beginning of something, maybe a copycat happening in legislatures across the country. This was the response of the Premier of Ontario when all of this broke. Roll tape.
In light of what is happening in Ottawa at this moment, I know that there is fear and uncertainty about what is happening. And I want to just say that there were some suggestions that perhaps we should suspend the proceedings of today, suspend question period. Our belief, and I have spoken with the leaders of the opposition parties, our belief is that people who are using violence to undermine democracy want us to be silenced. And we refuse to be silenced. We will not be silenced.
And all the leaders spoke, and question period went ahead, and it was regular proceedings at the Ontario legislature. Members of Parliament I've heard interviewed today have said they hope to get back to work tomorrow. They don't want to be cowed from doing their jobs. And Stock Day, maybe I could ask you, was it a mistake to cancel the hockey game tonight? Did that give this, if it is in fact a terrorist, did it give him a posthumous victory?
Well, I don't want to make anybody feel badly who made the decision on canceling that game. I'm sure they did it also out of respect for the soldier who died. I'm persuaded by some of Jonathan's remarks on this, and I think we can add to it, if that game had gone ahead, we all know very well there would have been a tremendous recognition with tens of thousands of Canadians standing there about our lost Army officer. It would have been a real moment of solidarity. People make these decisions based on what they're feeling on the moment in terms of honoring someone who was so recently slain. But I'm persuaded by what Jonathan said and what Premier Wynne said. I know here in British Columbia, the legislature closed. People have to make those decisions, but I like the thought of honor and acknowledge the terrible loss, but let's continue going forward and show one another and also a world out there that we are not going to be dissuaded, we are not going to be cowed by this, which brings to mind, Steve, when things happened in 2001, and also now I've heard some comments already about warning our soldiers not to wear their uniforms and not to wear the uniforms in public.
Well, that has happened. The military has put out an edict saying, don't wear your uniforms in public.
Unless you're on duty.
Unless you're on duty, but not if you're coming home, you know, don't do it.
I would have preferred to have seen that left up to individual soldiers. I know, quite a few soldiers, and they are a little bit offended about the fact that they can't proudly and courageously wear those uniforms home. So I'm sure it was done in a well-meaning way, but it would have been better, I think, if it had been at least voluntary and let those soldiers who want to walk home with that uniform on or drive home with that on, let them do so.
Let me get Christian Leuprecht on that, because you're the military expert on the panel here tonight. Christian, I've heard the same thing. I heard Lou Mackenzie interviewed the Major General earlier today on the issue of wearing the uniform, and it's about as tough a thing as you can tell a soldier not to do, is to be in their uniform when they want to be in their uniform. What's your view on whether or not they should be told, as they were, not to wear their uniform if they're off duty?
Well, we're of course only a couple of weeks away from Remembrance Day, when we commemorate sort of the great sacrifices that people made to defend our freedoms that we enjoy today. And so it's ironic that in such short, on such short timeline, we now have to, the men and women in uniform now have to be concerned for their own safety and security. It's also, I think, important to know that it's at this time that soldiers are citizen soldiers. They're part of society, and it's important to demonstrate that, especially in difficult times, our military is solidly embedded in our society. It represents our society, and that they are human beings who sign up for a difficult job. And so I think there's a certain symbolism that in a free and just society we demonstrate by having those individuals who sign up for unlimited liability to defend our interests beyond the boundaries of our country, being able to walk around safely within Canadian society. At the same time, if there is good intelligence and a genuine threat assessment that individuals in uniform may be at further risk, then it is probably a prudent step to take. But we want to make sure that it's based on good intelligence and the methodology that we have to analyze that intelligence, and not just on a knee-jerk reaction, because there's a risk in the aftermath of these sorts of events of drawing inferences and making knee-jerk reactions that then lead to precisely the sort of mantra that was pointed out of the terrorists winning.
Besma, though, I got an email from a member of the CF earlier today on this. Now, Christian makes the point as well. We are not far removed from Remembrance Day, when there are going to be thousands upon thousands of soldiers, current and past, in uniform, in public. We can't protect them. What do we do about this?
Well, I mean, I think that really soldiers, when they enlist, when they become a part of the Canadian Army, they take lots of risks, and I think they're used to that.
Not to die protecting monuments in Ottawa, though.
No, absolutely.
The risks they assume are overseas, I would think.
Absolutely. But I think that also we have to leave it to them to really choose this individually. Obviously, many will want to proudly wear, even in the days to come. I think despite this edict, I think we are going to see some people of our military who choose to do that, and I think we should support people taking on that individual choice and how they want to commemorate the fallen soldier. Obviously, I think that the military is trying to err on the side of caution. Everybody is in canceling games. I personally think that that was probably prudent under the circumstances of this so-called second shooter maybe on the loose. People didn't know. I think all of that is just unfortunately a reality of this situation. It makes obviously this, it's not the way we're used to things happening. We're much too accustomed to having our day-to-day activity go as normal, and I hope we get to that very soon.
This was a big deal in the United States, or at least parts of the United States today. I know I saw a tweet from the FBI in New York saying, we're ready to go. If you need our help, invite us up, we'll help you out. Hockey's a big deal in the state of Pennsylvania. The Flyers and the Penguins are playing tonight, and apparently the Penguins had a tribute at the beginning of the game to the city of Ottawa tonight and what it's gone through today. I want to just play this, Sheldon, let's play this clip from people. We went out in the streets today to find out what Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Ontario had to say about all of this, and let's play that clip now. Roll tape, please.
You know, as an American, the first thing I think about, you know, or the concept that we have of Canadians in America is that Canadians are more friendly people. So to think that it was an attack on Parliament, I'm assuming by Canadians, is very disheartening.
First impressions, I'm not surprised given the fact of 9/11. I think all Canadians need to be cognizant of this can happen, and that we're not, given the fact we live close to the United States, this is definitely a possibility, and I think that a lot of Canadians are naive about the whole thing.
I don't know if we've been naive, but I know that we haven't thought much about it because we've never really had any problems. But like I said, I think we all have to be on the cautious now, and we all have to be aware of who's around us at all times.
This is a very sad, unfortunate, horrific wake-up call to us as a nation that we must now be even more vigilant about gun activity, terrorism, without being racists.
An intense loss of innocence on the part of the whole nation. We won't be the same country, I think, tomorrow that we were this morning before it unfolded.
You know, I don't think this would change our values. We have a belief in letting everybody into our society, and our society is a pretty safe society.
I hope this Remembrance Day, people take it a little more seriously, because obviously, I mean, just based on what happened in Saint Jean the other day, and now the fact that it was a soldier first shot today, I think that they're targeting our soldiers.
Well, my first impression, of course, was shock. And then I guess I started to think the world is a different place now, and even Canada isn't immune, even though we like to think so.
I want to pick up on one of the comments that I heard Stockwell Day in the midst of all of that, and that is, again, not pushing the comparisons with 9/11 too much, but there's no question that America is a different country today than it was on September the 10th, 2001. It's indisputable. And my question is Canada now a different place today than it was yesterday, and will it be going forward? What's your view?
I believe we're different, and we will be going forward. Our hearts remain the same, but you know, I characterize it this way. I do some work for a company that offers cyber security services to companies to prevent cyber attacks, and also assessments in malls and public places. I can tell you that up until now, anyway, the degree of naivety that's out there, even among professionals in business, or providing things like security facilities, the level of naivety was somewhat surprising to me. I'm guessing, Steve, that level has dropped, and that we now have a very heightened awareness of the dangers that are out there. That will be more acute in our own psyche. I don't think it's going to change us as Canadians. The majority are being people who love others and are accepting of others, but we're going to be more careful.
Going forward, Christian Leuprecht, are we no longer going to be the same country?
Well, I think I mean there are echoes here of the October crisis and the way the government responded then, and it suggests, I think, that geostrategically we've perhaps as a country and society been somewhat isolated from the instabilities elsewhere in the world, and it shows that in the 21st century, perhaps as a result of both the communications and transportation revolutions that we've undergone over the last century, we are now no longer immune, and we need to be cognizant that the instabilities elsewhere in the world can have repercussions, very concrete repercussions for our society back here. And so what we do on the one hand to keep our own society safe, and on the other hand ensuring the stability of other societies is imperative to ensuring the public safety of all Canadians and Canadian interests.
Just wanted to confirm, when you talk about the October crisis, you mean October, Quebec, 1970, FLQ, that's what you're referring to?
Right, and I guess what I also refer to is that these incidents luckily have been fairly isolated in Canadian history, and so that we also need to I think recognize that as a society we've been fairly resilient. We have had, it seems, a fairly deterrent, effective legislative framework in place, and that by and large until now our security and criminal intelligence services have done an effective job at foiling these types of plots, and so we can only hope that this will be an outlier, but that, as the RCMP in its press conference today pointed out, will require Canadians to be more vigilant about those in our society who may want to do us harm. And it means that we now need to start to live like many other democratic societies in the world, with perhaps a certain amount of individuals in our very midst who want to do our way of life and us harm.
Okay. Jonathan Kay, your view on whether we're a different country going forward?
I really think we should have to put this in perspective a little bit. What happened in Ottawa was horrible, but ultimately it was one bad guy killing one good guy and then dying. It's extremely dramatic circumstances, extremely symbolic circumstances, but we're not at war. These things go in cycles. 100 years ago it was the anarchists. In the middle of the Cold War, there was a wave of communist-inspired groups. There was a period when planes were getting hijacked to Cuba every month. You know, there were murderous cults. Japan had a huge murderous cult problem. These things go up and down. And when 9/11 came, I remember there were people saying, we're at war, this is the new normal. and that we were going to have terrorist attacks every month, and that...
Well, if not terror, I mean, to be sure, there have not been terrorist attacks every month, but there's a new normal in the United States.
There's definitely a new normal when you go to an airport, and there definitely is a new normal if you're a Muslim or Arab suspect and you get taken in by the FBI.
Yeah.
But for the average citizen on the street, I don't think there is as much a new normal as they predicted 13 years ago when people were saying that there was going to be apocalyptic terrorist attacks every month. That hasn't happened. It's happened in part because of increased security awareness. But I would like to see the media and ordinary citizens not proclaim World War III every time some Islamist-inspired lunatic walks into a building and shoots somebody. I think it degrades the concept of what war is. I think if we ask our grandparents what things were like in World War II, when tens of thousands of people were dying every month, and that went on for years and years and years, and entire countries lay in ruins, which, by the way, is happening in the Middle East, but is not happening in Canada. I think maybe we can scale back a little bit about the rhetoric about everything has changed and we live in a different world as if it's some sci-fi movie and we're going to wake up to this apocalyptic landscape. This is one horribly deranged guy, probably inspired by radical Islam. I don't think we should allow him to redefine our society, and I certainly don't think we should allow him to turn the major tourist destinations in Ottawa into some kind of theme park where everything is behind cages and walls.
I hear you. This is one of those countries, though, where we always think this really ought not to happen here. America, of course, a violent society, tens of thousands of handgun murders a year. Not Canada, surely not Canada.
Yeah, that's because
right?
we're utopian narcissists, and this is how we react to every terrible thing. This is how we react when people kill each other at Jane and Finch here in Toronto. There is this spasm of moral vanity that takes place in Canada every time something horrible happens. And I agree that we have to wake up to the fact that that's silly, but I don't think we should see it as some kind of epic transition in our civilization. It's not that. And if we think that way, we have the danger of overreacting and taking away from this incredible open society that we have, especially in Ottawa. I mean, Parliament Hill embodies this open society where protesters and tourists and journalists flock there. I took my kids there over the summer. It was fantastic. And I would hate to see that changed because of what one horrible person did.
Besma, your view on whether we're in a new world now in Canada?
Well, I think what I'll wake up to is knowing what Canada and our comparative advantages in this country, institutions that work, a judicial process that I think is fair, that actually I think has a great tradition of jurists. Let the legal system work, let the investigation work, let our good forces in the police and security sector really investigate this properly. And at the end of the day, one of our last comparative advantages, I think, is our diverse society. And I hope that never changes. I hope that there are no awful looks given to people who we think are part of a war on them. We need to be very careful. And I think that's the Canada that I was born and raised in. I hope that's the Canada that stays.
John?
One thing I'd just like to say about the video, video from Parliament was shocking, where you heard the shots. I was actually inspired by that when you saw all these guys running in the direction of danger. This is what they were trained to do. I mean, there was one hero who we've named who apparently shot the murderer, but you had dozens of guys who were running to the gunshots. I mean, this is what they were trained to do. That's, to me, the inspiring thing we should take away from this. Personally, I would run fleeing in terror. But
you're not a first responder.
I'm not a first responder.
They are.
Yeah, I'm not even a second responder. But I was actually, when I was watching it, as horrified as I was also saying, wow, this is you hear about these security forces in Afghanistan and Iraq who run away sometimes, the first sign of danger. Here you have these people who are obviously well-trained patriots who are doing what we'd want them to do.
Let me give the less than a minute to Stock Day on this one, and that is to this end. I can remember about 25, maybe even 30 years ago right now, I think in Prince Edward Island there was a pipe bomb that blew up, and suddenly at legislatures across the country, security increased. And you used to be able to walk into the Ontario legislature and go anywhere you wanted in the building. Today you can't get by the first desk before they ask you for something. Stock Day, I understand the line is broken too, so Christian Leuprecht, let me put this to you with 30 seconds to go. Is the new normal going to be you can't even breathe in a legislature or parliament of this country going forward because the security is going to be so intense?
higher walls and bigger moats aren't going to prevent someone who really wants to do harm. It's going to be good security intelligence, criminal intelligence, a resilient society, and deterrent legislation. Sure, security measures will be reviewed, but I think the response was very well coordinated today. The political executive was safe, constitutional government continued, the rule of law was assured, and the Prime Minister and the executive continued to communicate with government, and so democratic government was sustained, and I think that shows that we have the processes in place to be resilient.
That's our time tonight, Christian. Forgive me. Time's up, but amen to what you said. Christian Leuprecht in Ottawa, Besma Momani, Jonathan Kay here in Toronto, and Stock Day as well on the line from Vancouver. It's good of you to all be with us tonight on this momentous day in our country.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.